Are you sure she even knows where Bordeaux is? The room exploded with laughter. Not loud laughter. Not the kind that comes from a real joke. The kind that comes from people who desperately want someone else to feel small. I froze with my hand still wrapped around a wine glass. Not because I was embarrassed. Not because I was shocked. But because the voice belonged to my husband. My husband. The man who had spent 9 years telling me I was his best friend. The man who thought I couldn't understand a single word he was saying. Because he was speaking French. And apparently, so was the woman standing beside him. The woman with the expensive red dress. The woman whose hand had been resting on his arm all evening. The woman he had introduced as just a coworker. I stood 20 feet away at a company gala, smiling politely while the blood slowly drained from my face. Honestly, the woman replied in French, lowering her voice while still smiling at the guests around her. She seemed sweet enough. Another pause. Then she laughed. The kind of woman men marry before they become successful. More laughter. My husband's laughter. And something inside me went very still. Because neither of them knew something. Something I had never bothered correcting. Something that suddenly became very important. I understood every word. Every single word. And what happened next changed everything. But before I tell you what I said, you need to understand how I got there. Because betrayal doesn't usually arrive all at once. Most of the time it arrives in small pieces. Tiny cuts. Tiny dismissals. Tiny moments that don't seem important until one day, you realize you've been bleeding for years. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 42 years old. And for most of my marriage, people assumed I was ordinary. I never corrected them. Maybe that was my first mistake. Or maybe it was my greatest strength. I'm still not sure. I met my husband, Daniel, when we were both 29. Back then, neither of us had much. He was ambitious, restless, always talking about where he was going, always talking about what he deserved. At first, I mistook that for confidence. A lot of women do. Confidence and entitlement often wear the same suit. You don't notice the difference until years later. By then, you're already invested, already committed, already making excuses. When I met Daniel, I had recently returned from Europe. Most people didn't know much about my life before then. And I preferred it that way. I had spent several years overseas working in international cultural programs. My French wasn't perfect, but it was fluent. I read it, spoke it, dreamed in it sometimes. But after returning home, it simply stopped being relevant. So I never mentioned it. And Daniel never asked. That detail would become important years later. At the time, he only saw what he wanted to see. A calm woman. A quiet woman. A woman who listened more than she spoke. And people often confuse silence with limitation. They assume quiet people have nothing to say. The truth is usually the opposite. The first few years of our marriage were good. Or at least good enough. Looking back, I can see warning signs. But warning signs rarely look dangerous when they're surrounded by affection. The first one came during a dinner party. A friend asked where I had studied. Before I could answer, Daniel answered for me. Naomi never cared much about prestige. Everyone laughed. I smiled. The conversation moved on. A tiny cut. A year later, another one. Someone complimented a presentation I'd given at a nonprofit event. Daniel smiled and said, "She's good with people. That's her thing. Not strategy. Not leadership. Not expertise. Just good with people." Another tiny cut. At the time, I told myself it wasn't important. Marriage requires grace. Marriage requires patience. Marriage requires understanding. At least that's what I believed. So I kept choosing peace. The problem is that some people interpret peace as permission. And Daniel slowly became one of those people. The more successful he became, the more he changed. Not all at once. Gradually. Like rust. Quiet. Patient. Almost invisible. His company grew. His salary grew. His ego grew fastest of all. The first thing to disappear was gratitude. The second thing was humility. Then came something worse. Embarrassment. Not his embarrassment. Mine. Or at least the version he wanted me to feel. He started correcting me in public. Interrupting me. Explaining things I already knew. Sometimes things I knew better than he did. It became a pattern. A performance. A strange little ritual where he established himself as the smartest person in every room, and somehow I became part of the act. First it was subtle, then it wasn't. One night we attended a fundraising event. I was speaking with a university dean. We were discussing international education programs, a topic I had spent years working in. Daniel walked over, listened for 20 seconds, then interrupted. "Don't let Naomi fool you," he said. The dean laughed politely. Daniel continued. "She makes everything sound more complicated than it is." The dean's smile faded. Mine did too, but only for a second, because women learn something very early. Sometimes maintaining dignity means refusing to fight every battle, especially when the person trying to embarrass you is your husband. The drive home was silent. I remember staring out the window, watching streetlights pass, one after another, like questions I wasn't ready to answer. Why does he keep doing this? Why am I allowing it? What happens if it gets worse? The truth frightened me, because deep down, I already knew it would. And it did. About 3 years before the gala, Daniel received a major promotion. The kind that changes how people treat you. Suddenly there were executive retreats, luxury hotels, private dinners, networking events, people obsessed with status, people obsessed with appearances, people who measured human worth like stock prices. Daniel loved it. He fit right in. I didn't. Not because I felt intimidated, because I found it exhausting. There's a difference. Real confidence doesn't need witnesses, but insecurity does. Those circles were full of people desperately performing success. Every conversation felt like a competition disguised as small talk. Who traveled more? Who earned more? Who knew more important people? Who had the better house? The better car? The better spouse? Especially the better spouse. And that's when I met Isabel, the coworker, the woman in the red dress, the woman standing beside my husband at the gala, the woman laughing in French. At first she was charming, almost suspiciously charming. The kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, but somehow made you feel excluded while doing it. The kind of woman who complimented you and insulted you in the same sentence. "Oh, Naomi, I love how natural you are." Natural. Not elegant. Not sophisticated. Natural. There was always something hidden underneath her words. Something sharp. Something deliberate. And over time I noticed something else. Daniel changed around her. His voice changed. His posture changed. His laugh changed. He became a man auditioning for approval. And that realization disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. One evening after a corporate dinner, Isabel smiled at me across the table. "Daniel says you don't really enjoy these events." I looked at him. He looked away. Interesting, because I had never said that. Not once. She continued smiling. "You seem happier in simpler environments." Simpler. There it was again. That language. Those little classifications. People like us. People like you. Special people. Ordinary people. The hierarchy existed entirely in their minds, but they treated it like law. I smiled politely. "Peaceful environments," I corrected. Her smile tightened. Only slightly, but I saw it. People reveal themselves in tiny moments. And Isabel revealed herself constantly. She just assumed nobody was paying attention. I was. Always. Months passed. The friendship between her and Daniel became harder to ignore. Nothing obvious. Nothing undeniable. Just enough discomfort to keep me awake at night. A text arriving after midnight. A joke they wouldn't explain. A glance that lingered too long. A shared secret. Then another. Then another. Every time I questioned it, Daniel acted offended. Not guilty. Offended. Which is often much more revealing. "You don't trust me?" That became his favorite sentence. Not an answer. A deflection. A way to put me on trial instead. And for a while, it worked. Until the gala. The night everything finally cracked. The night I heard them speaking French. The night they assumed I was too ordinary to understand. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers. Champagne flowed. People smiled. People posed. People performed. And across the room my husband and Isabel stood laughing together. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I wasn't searching for trouble. Trouble found me. Because then Daniel said something that made my stomach drop. In French. Perfectly clear. Perfectly confident. Completely unaware that I understood every word. She's comfortable, he said. She'll never leave. Isabel laughed softly. The kind of laugh that comes from someone who believes they're winning. And then she asked a question that changed everything. Are you going to tell her before the board announcement? I stopped breathing. Board announcement? Daniel smiled. A slow smile. A dangerous smile. And before Isabel could finish her sentence, both of them turned and looked directly at me. For the first time all night. As if suddenly remembering I existed. As if suddenly remembering there was a wife standing only a few feet away. Daniel raised his champagne glass, smiled, and started walking toward me, still believing I understood nothing, still believing I was exactly who they thought I was. Ordinary, quiet, safe, comfortable, a woman who would never leave. What he didn't know was that I already understood far more than he realized. And in less than 10 minutes, he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Daniel walked toward me with the same smile he'd been wearing all evening. The smile people mistake for confidence. The smile I had spent years decoding. To everyone else it looked warm. To me it looked rehearsed. By the time he reached me, Isabel had already turned away, pretending to speak with another executive. It was almost impressive. The speed, the precision, the way she could switch masks without missing a beat. Daniel kissed my cheek. Having fun. I stared at him, just for a second, not long enough to raise suspicion, just long enough to see if guilt would flicker across his face. Nothing. No guilt. No shame. No hesitation. Only confidence. The confidence of a man who believed he controlled the narrative. I am now, I said. Something in my voice made him pause. Only briefly. Then it disappeared. He smiled. There are some important people I'd like you to meet. Important people. That phrase again. As if human value came with a ranking system. As if some people deserved oxygen more than others. I nodded. Of course. For a moment I considered confronting him. Right there. Right then. I could have repeated every French sentence word for word. I could have watched the color leave his face. I could have shattered the entire evening. But something stopped me. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Instinct. The same instinct that had protected me my entire life. When people are exposing themselves, don't interrupt. Listen. Let them finish. The truth is always bigger than the first lie. And something told me there was more. Much more. So I followed him. Crossed the ballroom. Past executives. Past investors. Past smiling strangers carrying glasses worth more than some people's weekly grocery budget. And with every introduction I noticed something. Daniel wasn't introducing me as his wife. Not really. He was introducing me as an accessory. A detail. A supporting character. This is Naomi. Not. This is my wife. Not. This is the smartest person I know. Not. This is my partner. Just Naomi. As though my entire existence could fit into a first name. As though 9 years together had somehow become a footnote. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed public praise. I didn't. But respect and praise are not the same thing. Respect is acknowledgement, recognition, visibility. And for months, maybe years, I had been slowly disappearing from my own marriage. The frightening part? I wasn't sure Daniel even noticed. A few minutes later, another executive joined the group. A tall man with silver hair and expensive confidence. The kind of confidence money buys when wisdom doesn't. He shook Daniel's hand, then looked at me. You're Naomi? I smiled politely. I am. His eyebrows lifted. Interesting. Almost surprised. Then he laughed. I've heard so much about you. The room grew strangely quiet. Daniel's smile tightened. Very slightly. The executive continued. You must be incredibly patient. Laughter. Several people laughed, including Isabel. And suddenly I understood something. This wasn't the first time my name had come up in conversations I wasn't part of. Not even close. The realization landed heavily. How often had Daniel discussed me? How often had I become entertainment? How often had my marriage become office gossip? The executive kept talking. Daniel always says you're the reason his life stays simple. Simple. Again. There it was. That word. That little box they kept trying to place me inside. Simple. Comfortable. Ordinary. Safe. I smiled. But inside something was changing. Something old. Something patient. Something that had been sleeping for years. The conversation drifted elsewhere. Yet one question refused to leave my mind. The board announcement. What announcement? And why was Isabel asking whether Daniel planned to tell me? The answer should have been obvious. An affair. Most people would assume that immediately. Part of me did too. But another part wasn't convinced. There was something about the way she asked it. Something strategic. Something larger. As though whatever they were hiding involved more than emotions. More than romance. More than betrayal. And that possibility unsettled me far more. Because affairs destroy marriages. But secrets involving power? Those destroy lives. An hour later, I found myself alone near the terrace. The ballroom noise faded behind me. Cool air brushed my face. For the first time all evening I could breathe. At least until I heard Isabel's voice. Again. French. Closer this time. She hadn't seen me. Neither had the woman standing beside her. Another executive. Another smile. Another expensive dress. The wife has no idea, Isabel said. My stomach tightened. The other woman laughed. None. None. And afterward? Isabel shrugged. Afterward won't matter. The women exchanged a look. One of those looks people share when they think they're smarter than everyone else. When they think they've already won. Then the other woman asked something that made my pulse spike. What happens when she finds out about the shares? Shares. Not an affair. Not romance. Shares. Suddenly every instinct inside me screamed. Pay attention. Isabel lowered her voice. I stepped closer, barely breathing. And then, someone opened the terrace door behind me. The noise swallowed the rest. The conversation ended. The women walked away. And I was left standing alone. Heart racing. Mind spinning. Shares? What shares? For the first time all evening, genuine concern replaced anger. Because now something wasn't making sense. At all. You see, Daniel handled most of our finances. Not because I couldn't. Because I trusted him. A decision that suddenly felt very expensive. What exactly had he been doing? And more importantly, what had he not told me? I returned to the ballroom. This time watching everything differently. Every smile. Every glance. Every interaction. And once you start looking closely at people, you discover things. Tiny things. Important things. For example, Daniel and Isabel rarely touched. At least not openly. They were too smart for that. But they constantly monitored each other. Their eyes searched for each other. Found each other. Checked each other's reactions. It wasn't physical. It was strategic. Like business partners protecting a secret. That realization made me even more uneasy. Because emotional affairs are messy. But strategic alliances? Those are calculated. And calculations usually involve planning. A few minutes later, Daniel stepped onto the stage. The room quieted. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Including mine. He looked confident. Excited. Almost triumphant. The CEO stood beside him. Several board members too. Champagne glasses lifted. People smiled. And suddenly I knew. The announcement was happening now. Whatever secret they'd been discussing. I was about to hear it. The CEO tapped the microphone. Tonight marks a major milestone. Applause. More smiles. More excitement. Then he continued. We are proud to announce the newest addition to our executive leadership team. The room erupted. Daniel smiled broadly. Everyone knew. Everyone except me. And that realization hit harder than I expected. People around us were already congratulating him. Already celebrating. Already aware of a future I hadn't been invited into. The CEO placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Beginning next quarter, Daniel Carter will become Executive Vice President. Thunderous applause. The room exploded. Daniel beamed. Cameras flashed. Champagne poured. People rushed toward him. And for a moment, I genuinely felt proud. Despite everything. Despite the hurt. Despite the disrespect. I remembered the young man I met years ago. The man with dreams bigger than his paycheck. The man who worked nights. The man who believed he could build something meaningful. For one brief second, I was happy for him. Then the CEO continued speaking, and everything changed. Along with this promotion comes a substantial executive equity package. The room applauded again, but this time my attention sharpened. Equity package. Shares. The word echoed inside my head. Then came the sentence that made my stomach drop. The restructuring process has been months in the making. Months. 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 I looked at Daniel. His eyes never met mine. Not once. The applause continued, but suddenly I wasn't hearing any of it, because a question kept growing louder. If this had been planned for months, why was I only learning about it now? The answer arrived almost immediately. Not from Daniel. From the woman standing beside me. A woman I'd never met before. She leaned closer and smiled warmly. The smile of someone trying to be kind, trying to help, trying to fix a mistake. And that's why she didn't realize what she was about to reveal. You must be relieved. I blinked. Relieved. She nodded. Of course. A pause. Then she said the sentence that made my entire body go cold. After all the paperwork you signed. My heart stopped. Paperwork. I stared at her. She kept smiling, completely unaware. Daniel said you handled everything weeks ago. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller, hotter, louder. I couldn't hear the rest, because there was only one thought left. I hadn't signed anything. Not weeks ago. Not months ago. Not ever. And as Daniel stood on that stage smiling for cameras, a terrible realization began forming in my mind. Someone had signed those documents. Someone. Just not me. And for the first time that night, I wasn't thinking about betrayal. I was thinking about danger. Real danger. The kind that hides behind expensive suits and polite smiles. The kind that destroys people before they even realize they're under attack. And somewhere across the ballroom, Isabel looked directly at me. No smile this time. No fake kindness. No performance. Just a long, steady stare. As if she suddenly understood something. As if she realized the wife wasn't as clueless as everyone thought. As if she knew the game had changed. And when she slowly looked away, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever Daniel and Isabel had been hiding, it was much bigger than an affair. Much bigger than a promotion. And before this night was over, the truth was going to come out. Whether they were ready or not. I hadn't signed anything. That thought kept repeating in my head like a warning siren. Not a whisper. Not a concern. A warning. The ballroom was still celebrating. Champagne glasses clinked. People laughed. The band played softly in the background. But for me, the entire room had changed. Because once you realize someone may have lied about legal documents, every memory starts rearranging itself. Every strange conversation. Every rush signature request, every unexplained financial discussion, suddenly none of it feels random anymore. Feels connected. And the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Across the room, Daniel was surrounded by executives, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, smiling for photographs, playing the role of successful family man, the role he had perfected over the years. But now all I could see was the gap. The gap between who he pretended to be and who he was becoming, or maybe who he had always been. That possibility hurt the most. A waiter passed by. I took a glass of water. Not wine. Water. Because I needed a clear head. Emotion is expensive, especially when other people are counting on you to lose control. And suddenly I realized something important. Nobody seemed worried. Not Daniel. Not Isabel. Not the executives. Not anyone. Which meant they believed their secret was safe. Completely safe. That confidence could only come from one thing. They thought I knew less than I actually knew. That was an advantage. A very valuable advantage. And I had no intention of wasting it. So instead of confronting anyone, I smiled. I congratulated people. I shook hands. I played my role. The supportive wife. The proud spouse. The woman who supposedly understood nothing. And the more invisible I became, the more people talked. It's amazing what people reveal when they stop seeing you as a threat. One executive told me Daniel was finally moving into the circles he belonged in. Another told me the promotion had been expected for months. Months. That word again. Months. Everyone seemed aware of plans that somehow never reached me. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the paperwork comment had been a misunderstanding. Maybe Isabel was simply a toxic coworker who enjoyed creating drama. Maybe. But deep down, something felt wrong. And instincts like that don't appear from nowhere. They appear because your subconscious notices things your heart is still trying to excuse. About 30 minutes later, I excused myself and headed toward the restroom. Not because I needed it. Because I needed privacy. A few minutes alone. A chance to think. The hallway outside was quiet. Empty. The noise from the ballroom became distant. Muffled. Almost peaceful. And that's when I heard voices again. French. I stopped walking. Immediately, the voices were coming from around the corner. Daniel. And Isabel. My pulse quickened. Not because I was nervous. Because I finally had an opportunity. Without cameras. Without executives. Without performances. Just the truth. I moved closer. Carefully. Close enough to hear. Far enough to remain unseen. And then Daniel spoke. What happened? His voice sounded irritated. Not affectionate. Not romantic. I frowned. Isabel answered. She knows something. Silence. A long silence. Then Daniel laughed. A forced laugh. An uncomfortable laugh. Naomi doesn't know anything. My stomach tightened. The certainty in his voice was almost insulting. Not because he doubted my intelligence. Because he genuinely believed it. That realization landed heavily. After 9 years, this man truly had no idea who I was. None. And somehow that hurt more than the betrayal itself. Isabel wasn't convinced. I saw her expression. Daniel sighed. You're imagining things. No. Another pause. Then Isabel lowered her voice. She's smarter than you think. The silence that followed felt different. Heavier. And for the first time all night, Daniel didn't immediately disagree. Interesting. Very interesting. Eventually he spoke. It doesn't matter. My pulse quickened. Because those 4 words never lead anywhere good. It doesn't matter. Not when secrets are involved. Not when trust is involved. Not when someone's future is involved. Isabel crossed her arms. You still haven't told her. I will. When? No answer. The silence stretched. Then Daniel finally spoke. And every word made me colder. After everything is finalized. Finalized. There it was. Not if. When. Whatever they were hiding wasn't theoretical. It was already happening. Already moving forward. Already becoming real. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. Without my involvement. And somehow, I was the last person to know. A familiar pain settled in my chest. Not panic. Not fear. Disappointment. Because betrayal from strangers feels different. Strangers don't owe you loyalty. But people you love, people you build a life with, their betrayals cut differently. They reach places nobody else can reach. Daniel continued. There's no point creating unnecessary drama. Unnecessary drama. I nearly laughed. The audacity. The arrogance. The ability to redefine someone else's pain as inconvenience. It was astonishing. And suddenly I remembered something. A conversation from nearly 8 months earlier. A random Tuesday evening. One of those ordinary moments people forget. At least until they become important. Daniel had arrived home carrying a stack of documents. He seemed distracted. Preoccupied. Excited. I asked what was wrong. He smiled. Just corporate stuff. Then he casually asked if I could sign something later in the week. Nothing urgent. Nothing complicated. Just routine paperwork. At the time I barely thought about it. Because why would I? We were married. I trusted him. Then the paperwork disappeared. The conversation disappeared. And somehow I never saw those documents again. Back then it seemed insignificant. Now, not so much. The memory lingered. growing larger by the second, because the more I examined it, the stranger it became, especially one detail. I had never signed anything, yet multiple people seemed convinced I had. The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Around the corner, Isabel spoke again. You know this could get ugly. Daniel sighed. Only if she finds out. Only if she finds out. Not if it's wrong. Not if it's unfair. Not if it's unethical. Only if she finds out. That sentence told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. People reveal themselves through what they fear. And Daniel wasn't afraid of doing something harmful. He was afraid of consequences. A very different thing. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Footsteps approached. I quickly moved away before they could see me. By the time they entered the hallway, I was already walking toward the ballroom. Calm, composed, invisible. Exactly how they liked me. Exactly how they underestimated me. The irony almost made me smile. Back inside, the celebration continued. Yet something had shifted inside me. For years I had been trying to save the version of Daniel I fell in love with. The version who respected me. The version who valued honesty. The version who treated me like a partner. But standing there that night, I realized something painful. You can't save someone who benefits from your blindness. And Daniel had benefited from mine for a very long time. Around midnight, the gala finally ended. People began leaving. Valets retrieved luxury cars. Executives exchanged final handshakes. Goodbyes filled the air. And through it all, Daniel acted perfectly normal. Too normal. Almost cheerful. As though nothing had happened. As though there wasn't a growing storm sitting silently beside him. The drive home was strange. Not tense. Not argumentative. Strange. Daniel kept talking about the promotion, the opportunities, the future, the new responsibilities. I listened quietly, and the more he talked, the more obvious it became. He wasn't sharing his future with me. He was informing me about it, as if decisions had already been made, as if my role was simply to adapt, to accommodate, to support, to follow. At one point he laughed. Things are really changing. I looked out the window, watching city lights blur past. Yes, I said softly. They are. For a brief moment, I thought he might hear the meaning underneath those words. He didn't. He just kept driving. When we finally reached home, he headed upstairs almost immediately, claiming exhaustion, claiming he had early meetings, claiming he needed sleep. Maybe he did. Or maybe he simply didn't want questions. Either way, I let him go. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close. Then I walked into my home office, closed the door, and sat down, alone. For several minutes I simply stared at the desk, thinking, remembering, connecting pieces. Then I opened a drawer. Inside was something I hadn't looked at in years. An old leather folder. Simple, unremarkable, the kind of thing most people would ignore. But inside that folder were records, documents, correspondence, information. Not because I was suspicious, because I was organized. A habit from another chapter of my life. A chapter Daniel rarely asked about. A chapter most people never knew existed. I opened the folder slowly, methodically, page after page, record after record. And as I reviewed the contents, something became very clear, painfully clear. The woman Daniel thought he married, and the woman he actually married, were two very different people. The gap between those versions was enormous, much larger than he realized, much more dangerous than he realized. For years I had allowed people to underestimate me, allowed them to assume, allowed them to create their own story. But assumptions become liabilities when people start building schemes around them. And Daniel had built an entire future around one assumption. That I would never look closely, never ask questions, never understand, never fight back. He was wrong, terribly wrong. I reached for my phone, scrolled through old contacts, names I hadn't spoken to in years, people from another life, another world, a world Daniel barely knew existed. My thumb hovered over one name, then another, then another. For the first time all night, I smiled, not because I was happy, because I was finally thinking clearly, because confusion was turning into certainty, because pieces were starting to fit together, and because tomorrow morning, I was going to learn exactly what documents everyone thought I had signed, exactly what shares Isabel was talking about, exactly what Daniel had been hiding. The answers were finally within reach. What I didn't know yet was that the truth would be far worse than I imagined, and when it finally surfaced, it wouldn't just threaten Daniel's promotion, it would threaten everything he had spent years building. Everything. I barely slept, not because I was emotional, because I was thinking. There is a difference. People often assume calm means unbothered. Doesn't. Sometimes calm is simply what happens when your mind moves faster than your emotions. And that night my mind was racing. Every conversation, every strange comment, every missing explanation, every uncomfortable moment from the past year kept resurfacing. Not randomly, like puzzle pieces. And for the first time they were beginning to form a picture. A picture I didn't like. At 6:30 the next morning, I was already sitting in my office downstairs. Coffee untouched. Laptop open. Leather folder beside me. The house was silent. Daniel was still asleep. For now. I stared at my phone, then finally made the call. The first call. Not to a friend. Not to a family member. Not to anyone connected to Daniel. To someone from my past. Someone Daniel knew existed, but never really paid attention to. Which, ironically, was exactly why she was useful. The phone rang twice. Then a familiar voice answered. Naomi. A smile touched my face. Good morning, Camille. A pause. Then immediate concern. What's wrong? Some people know you well enough to hear the truth before you speak it. Camille was one of those people. We had worked together years ago in Europe. Long before Daniel. Long before marriage. Long before I learned how expensive trust could become. She had remained one of the few people from that chapter of my life whom I still occasionally spoke with. Not often, but enough. And unlike most people, Camille knew exactly who I was. Not the simplified version. Not the quiet wife. Not the supportive spouse. The real version. The complete version. I took a slow breath. I need help. Silence. Then one sentence. What happened? 20 minutes later, I told her everything. Not every detail. Just enough. The gala. The French conversations. The paperwork. The shares. The promotion. The secrecy. When I finished speaking, there was a long pause. Then Camille asked a question that immediately sharpened my attention. Have you checked the filings? I blinked. What filings? Another pause. Then, oh Naomi. My stomach tightened. That wasn't a good tone. Not at all. Camille continued. If there's executive restructuring, there may be disclosures. The room suddenly felt smaller. I opened my laptop. Immediately. What exactly am I looking for? For the next 30 minutes, Camille walked me through several public records. Corporate disclosures. Regulatory documents. Executive notices. Nothing dramatic. Nothing glamorous. Just paperwork. The kind most people never read. The kind arrogant people assume nobody will ever examine. And then, we found it. At first I wasn't sure what I was looking at. The language was dense. Technical. Boring. Until one particular section caught my attention. My name. My full legal name. Listed inside a disclosure. My pulse quickened. I leaned closer. Read it again. Then again. Then a fourth time. No. That couldn't be right. I kept reading. The words refused to change. The document listed me as having approved a transfer. A transfer involving ownership interests connected to Daniel's compensation package. My heart started pounding. Because I knew with absolute certainty. I had never approved anything. Not verbally. Not electronically. Not physically. Not ever. Camille's voice came through the phone. What does it say? I swallowed hard. Then read it aloud. Silence. A long silence. The kind that feels heavy. Dangerous. Finally she spoke. Naomi. Another pause. You need copies of everything. The seriousness in her voice made my stomach twist. I nodded. Even though she couldn't see me. I know. No. Her tone sharpened. You don't understand. A chill ran through me. because suddenly Camille sounded less like an old friend and more like someone evaluating a crisis. You need every document. The room became very quiet. I stared at the screen, then whispered, "Why?" Her answer arrived immediately. Because she already knew what I was slowly beginning to suspect. Because if your name was used without authorization. She stopped, then finished carefully. This isn't a marriage problem anymore. The words hit hard. Very hard. Because deep down, I knew she was right. This wasn't about hurt feelings. This wasn't about disrespect. This wasn't about Isabel. This wasn't even about infidelity anymore. This had entered a completely different territory. And suddenly I understood why Isabel had seemed nervous. Why Daniel kept delaying the conversation. Why everyone assumed I had already signed paperwork. Because somebody needed that assumption to be true. Very badly. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Daniel. Awake. I immediately closed several windows. Not out of fear. Out of strategy. The time for confrontation had not arrived. Not yet. Camille sensed my hesitation. Is he there? Yes. Another pause. Then she asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked toward the staircase. Thinking. Calculating. Watching. Then I smiled. A very small smile. The kind people rarely notice. I'm going to let him keep talking. Camille laughed softly. There was no humor in it. Only understanding. Poor Daniel. A few minutes later we ended the call. I sat quietly, reviewing everything again. Carefully. Methodically. Because details matter. Especially when other people are relying on confusion. And one detail kept bothering me. The timing. Why now? Why risk something like this now? Daniel wasn't desperate. He wasn't struggling financially. The promotion was already happening. So why? What was worth this level of deception? The answer arrived unexpectedly. 2 hours later. Through an email. An email that wasn't intended for me. At least not directly. It appeared because one of Daniel's corporate accounts remained linked to our home office printer. Something neither of us had thought about in years. Normally I wouldn't have noticed. But that morning paper suddenly slid from the printer tray. One page. Then another. Then another. I walked over. Picked them up. And froze. Because Isabel's name appeared immediately. So did Daniel's. So did the words. Projected Executive Transition Strategy. My pulse accelerated. I started reading. The further I read, the colder I became. Because suddenly everything made sense. Not all of it. But enough. Enough to understand the direction. Enough to understand the plan. Enough to understand why I had become inconvenient. The document wasn't discussing romance. It wasn't discussing marriage. It wasn't discussing emotions. It was discussing optics, image, perception, branding, corporate positioning. And buried inside those discussions was a sentence I will never forget. A sentence that changed everything. It read, "Current spousal profile may limit future executive opportunities." I stared at the words. Again, and again, and again. Current spousal profile. Me. They were talking about me. My entire body went still. Not from sadness. Not from anger. Something colder. Much colder. Because for the first time, I understood exactly how these people saw the world. Human beings weren't people. They were assets. Liabilities. Advantages. Obstacles. Everything had a market value. Everything. Even marriage. Especially marriage. And according to someone in that company, I had become a liability, problem, an obstacle, a woman who no longer fit the image. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, clarified everything. Years of confusion vanished in seconds. The dismissive comments, the embarrassment, the exclusion, the constant references to being simple, the obsession with status, the fascination with appearances. Suddenly it all aligned. Because Daniel hadn't simply changed. He had adopted an entirely different value system. One where loyalty mattered less than image. One where respect mattered less than advancement. One where people became disposable. Including me. I heard footsteps approaching. Daniel entered the office doorway. Still holding his coffee. Still looking relaxed. still completely unaware. His eyes landed on me, then on the papers. Only briefly, but I caught it. Flicker. Tiny. Almost invisible. Fear. The first genuine fear I had seen from him in years. And then it vanished, replaced by a smile. Always the smile. Working already? I looked up. Calmly. Quietly. Steadily. The same way I had looked at him thousands of times before. Only this time. Everything was different. Couldn't sleep. His smile remained, but something behind it shifted. A tiny crack. A tiny uncertainty. The first fracture in the illusion. Big night yesterday. Yes. Another pause. He sipped his coffee, studying me, trying to read me. For once. He couldn't. And that bothered him. I could see it, feel it, taste it in the silence between us. Then he asked a simple question. A harmless question. At least on the surface. Everything okay? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was astonishing. The man sitting across from me had spent months, possibly longer, building a future without my knowledge. Using my trust as cover. Allowing people to discuss me like an obstacle. Allowing assumptions about my approval. Allowing lies to spread. And now he was asking if everything was okay. The irony was breathtaking. I folded the document slowly, placed it face down on the desk, then looked directly into his eyes. Actually, Daniel. His smile froze. Not completely. Just enough. The smallest hesitation. The smallest warning. The first sign that somewhere deep inside, his instincts were beginning to wake up. Beginning to realize something was wrong. Very wrong. And then I said the sentence that would start unraveling everything he thought was secure. Everything he thought was hidden. Everything he thought I would never understand. There's something we need to talk about. For the first time all morning, Daniel looked nervous. And he had absolutely no idea how much trouble he was in. There's something we need to talk about. For a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us blinked. The silence between us felt different now. Not the comfortable silence of a married couple. Not the familiar silence of routine. This was the silence that happens right before a storm breaks. Daniel set his coffee down. Carefully. Too carefully. I'm listening. His voice sounded normal. But his eyes didn't. His eyes were calculating, measuring, trying to determine how much I knew. And more importantly, how much danger he was in. I folded my hands on the desk. Calmly. No anger. No accusations. No dramatic confrontation. People reveal more when they think they still have control. So I gave him that illusion. For now. I was surprised by the promotion. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Too quickly. Interesting. That wasn't the topic he feared most. Thank you. I nodded. It seems many people already knew. A pause. Before I did, the relaxation disappeared. Not completely. Just enough. I wanted it to be official first. A reasonable answer. Conveniently reasonable. The kind liars often use. Because the best lies sound responsible. I smiled. I see. He nodded. Confident again. Believing he had successfully navigated the conversation. Believing the danger had passed. Then I asked, how long has the restructuring been happening? His face remained still. Years of corporate experience had clearly taught him emotional discipline. But not enough. I still caught it. Tiny hesitation. Barely visible. Months. Maybe longer. He was deciding how much truth was safe. Eventually he answered. Several months. There it was. Several months. The same timeline everyone kept mentioning. Everyone except him. I nodded again. Slowly. And the equity transfer? The room froze. Not literally, but emotionally. Everything stopped. The air. The rhythm. The comfort. The illusion. For the first time that morning, Daniel looked genuinely unsettled. Not terrified. Not yet. But surprised. Very surprised. His eyes narrowed slightly. Where did you hear about that? Notice what he didn't say. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't ask whether I misunderstood. He asked where I heard about it, which meant he knew exactly what I was talking about. And that told me more than any answer could have. I leaned back, watching him. studying him, the same way he had underestimated me for years. Only now the roles were beginning to reverse. I've heard a lot of things recently. The silence stretched. Neither of us spoke. Then Daniel did something fascinating. He smiled. Again. But this smile wasn't confident. It was strategic. The smile of someone attempting damage control. Naomi. He sighed softly. As usual, you're overthinking. Overthinking. There it was. One of his favorite weapons. Not because it was true, because it was effective. For years. Whenever I noticed inconsistencies, whenever I raised concerns, whenever I questioned something uncomfortable, the response was always similar. You're sensitive. You're overthinking. You're imagining things. It's remarkable how often people use confusion as a defense, especially when clarity threatens them. But this time, something was different. This time I wasn't seeking reassurance. I was gathering information, and he still hadn't realized that. I tilted my head slightly. Am I? A pause. Then I reached toward the printer papers. The ones I'd folded face down. The ones he desperately hoped I hadn't examined closely. And I slowly turned them around. His expression changed instantly. Not dramatically. Not enough for most people to notice. But I noticed. Because I had spent 9 years studying this man's face. 9 years watching micro-expressions. Tiny reactions. Small emotional leaks. And in that moment, I saw fear. Real fear. The first honest emotion I'd seen all morning. His eyes landed on the document, then immediately returned to me. Too quickly. The reaction of someone who already knows what's inside. The reaction of someone who wishes it weren't there. Neither of us spoke. For several seconds. Then Daniel exhaled. Slowly. And said, "This isn't what it looks like." The oldest sentence in human history. Not what it looks like. I've always found that phrase interesting. Because nobody says it when things look good. Nobody says it when they're innocent. Nobody says it when they're proud. They say it when they're caught. I remained silent. And silence can be devastating. Much more devastating than yelling. People expect arguments. They prepare for arguments. Silence forces them to continue talking. And eventually, they reveal themselves. Daniel shifted in his chair. You don't understand the context. Still talking. Good. Then explain it. Another pause. His eyes drifted toward the document again. Then back to me. The company has certain expectations. I said nothing. The board looks at everything. Nothing. Perception matters. Still nothing. And then, without realizing it, Daniel said the quiet part out loud. The executive level is different. I stared at him, waiting, watching, allowing the silence to stretch. Long enough for him to hear himself. Long enough for him to realize what he was admitting. His voice softened. As people move higher. A pause. Their personal lives come under scrutiny. There it was. Not a confession. But close. Very close. I looked directly into his eyes. And where do I fit into that? The question landed hard. Because suddenly there was nowhere left to hide. No corporate language. No vague explanations. No executive jargon. Just truth. Or something close to it. Daniel rubbed his jaw. A nervous habit he rarely displayed. I never said you didn't. The answer arrived immediately. Which meant he had prepared it before. Interesting. Very interesting. I didn't ask what you said. Silence. I asked where I fit. The room became painfully quiet. And suddenly, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt. Not exactly. Shame. Small. Hidden. But present. Because deep down, Daniel knew. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew exactly how he'd allowed people to treat me. He knew exactly what conversations had taken place behind closed doors. And for one brief moment, the weight of that reality reached him. Then his defenses returned. Faster than ever. You're making this personal. The sentence almost made me laugh. Making it personal. My marriage. My name. My legal approval. My future. My reputation. And somehow I was the one making it personal. The level of arrogance was almost impressive. I stood slowly. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. simply stood. And the moment I did, something changed. Because for years Daniel had grown accustomed to controlling conversations, guiding them, managing them. But now he was reacting, following, trying to keep up. The balance of power was shifting, and he could feel it, even if he didn't fully understand why. I walked toward the window, looking out across the backyard. Sunlight spilled across the grass. Peaceful, quiet, normal. A strange contrast to the conversation happening inside. Then I asked a question that hit him much harder than the others. Who signed the documents? Silence. Complete silence. I turned around. Daniel hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even attempted an answer. And that silence told me everything. Because innocent people answer questions. Guilty people evaluate them. His eyes lowered briefly, then returned to mine. And in that instant, I knew. Not the full truth. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know he was involved. Enough to know he had crossed a line. Enough to know this wasn't misunderstanding. It was deception. Deliberate deception. His voice finally returned. Low. Careful. Measured. Naomi. And suddenly something unexpected happened. My phone rang. Both of us looked down. The screen lit up. A name appeared. A name Daniel hadn't seen in years. But one he recognized instantly. Camille. The color drained slightly from his face. Just slightly. Yet enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough for me to realize something important. He remembered Camille. More importantly, he remembered the chapter of my life she belonged to. A chapter he had never cared enough to understand. A chapter he had always dismissed. Just like he'd dismissed me. And for the first time all morning, a new emotion appeared in his eyes. Concern. Real concern. Because suddenly he wasn't sure what I knew. Who I had spoken to. What resources I had. Or what might happen next. I let the phone ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Never taking my eyes off him. Then I answered. Good morning, Camille. Her voice came through immediately. Clear. Professional. Focused. Naomi. A pause. Then words that changed everything. I found the original filing. The room went completely silent. And the look on Daniel's face told me one thing. Whatever was in that filing. He desperately did not want me to see it. I found the original filing. Camille's voice echoed through the phone. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that feels alive. The kind that exposes people. I never looked away from Daniel. And for the first time since I'd met him, I watched confidence leave his face completely. Not weaken. Not crack. Leave. Gone. His jaw tightened. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes darted briefly toward the phone. Then back to me. And in that moment, something became painfully clear. Whatever was in that filing. He already knew. Can you send it? I asked. Already sent. My email notification appeared instantly. Daniel saw it. I saw him see it. And suddenly the man who had spent years controlling every conversation had absolutely no control over this one. I opened the email. Slowly. Deliberately. No rush. No panic. No drama. The same calm that had always made people underestimate me. The same calm that was terrifying Daniel now. Because calm people are difficult to manipulate. The document loaded. I scanned the first page. Then the second. Then the third. And there it was. The truth. Not a suspicion. Not a theory. The truth. Cold. Clear. Documented. Months earlier, paperwork had been submitted as part of Daniel's executive compensation restructuring. The filing contained approvals attributed to me. Approvals I never gave. Signatures I never signed. Authorizations I never authorized. My name had been used. My consent had been assumed. My voice had been erased. And somebody had expected me never to notice. For several seconds I simply stared at the screen. Not because I was shocked. Because I was grieving. That's what people don't tell you about betrayal. The first thing that dies isn't trust. It's the version of the person you loved. The version you've been protecting. The version you've been making excuses for. That version finally disappears. And once it does, you can never bring it back. I looked up. Daniel was watching me, waiting, hoping, calculating, still trying to determine whether there was a way out. There wasn't. Not anymore. How long? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. How long? Another silence. Then, Naomi. No. My voice remained calm, steady, controlled. The calmness seemed to frighten him more than anger would have. How long? Finally he spoke, barely above a whisper. 6 months. 6 months. 6 months. I nodded slowly, as though he had simply confirmed the weather. Inside, however, something settled permanently. 6 months of deception. 6 months of conversations. 6 months of decisions. 6 months of watching me smile at dinner while building a future behind my back. A future I wasn't invited into. And suddenly I remembered something. Something Isabel had said. The wife has no idea. Not concern. Not guilt. Certainty. Confidence. Because both of them had spent months treating me like an obstacle. A simple woman. A comfortable woman. A woman who would never leave. The irony almost hurt. Because they never bothered asking who I actually was. Daniel stood. I was going to tell you. There it was. The final refuge of people who get caught. I was going to tell you. Eventually. Later. When it was convenient. When the risk was gone. When the decision was already irreversible. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time in years, I felt no need to protect him. No need to soften reality. No need to rescue him from the consequences of his own choices. You weren't going to tell me. His face tightened. That's not fair. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was astonishing. Fair. The man who had spent 6 months hiding legal documents was suddenly concerned about fairness. The lack of self-awareness was breathtaking. You let people believe I approved something I never saw. Silence. You let executives discuss me like a liability. More silence. You let another woman stand beside you and laugh about me. His eyes lowered. For the first time. Finally. Crack. A real one. And then I said the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that ended 9 years of being underestimated. The sentence that made him realize exactly who he had married. I understood every word of those French conversations. The color vanished from his face. Completely. Not partially. Not subtly. Completely. He looked like someone had pulled the floor from beneath him. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Couldn't even process what he'd heard. You. His voice cracked. You speak French. I stared at him. A long silence passed. Then I laughed. Softly. Not cruelly. Just sadly. And that laugh seemed to hurt him more than anything else. Because suddenly he understood. All those years. All those assumptions. All those conversations. All those judgments. And he had never even known one of the most basic things about his own wife. Not because I hid it. Because he never cared enough to ask. The realization landed visibly. Painfully. You thought I didn't understand. Silence. You thought I was standing there smiling while you and Isabel discussed my life. Another silence. You thought I was invisible. The room felt smaller. Heavier. Every truth finding its place. And for once, Daniel had nowhere to run. No corporate language. No executive spin. No clever explanation. Just consequences. Raw consequences. Eventually he sat down again. Slowly. Like a man carrying something heavy. And perhaps for the first time in years. He stopped defending himself. Stopped performing. Stopped managing perceptions. He simply looked tired. Very tired. What do you want me to say? The question hung in the air. I thought about it carefully. Because the truth surprised even me. I don't need you to say anything. His eyes lifted. Confused. Lost. Then I continued. I spent years wanting explanations. A pause. Now I have them. And that was the truth. The mystery was gone. The confusion was gone. The excuses were gone. All that remained was clarity. And clarity is a kind of freedom. Painful freedom. But freedom nonetheless. 3 days later things began collapsing. Not because of revenge. Because of facts. Facts have a way of doing that. The filings were reviewed. Questions were raised. Internal investigations began. Lawyers became involved. Conversations grew uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. The board that had been celebrating suddenly became concerned. The executives who loved appearances suddenly found themselves explaining paperwork. And Isabel? She disappeared almost immediately. Interesting how quickly loyalty evaporates when consequences arrive. The alliance that had seemed so powerful turned out to be surprisingly fragile. Most performative relationships are. Because they're built on mutual benefit. Not character. Not integrity. Not trust. Benefit. And once benefit disappears, so does the relationship. Within weeks, Daniel's promotion stalled. Then froze. Then vanished. Not because of me. Because of decisions he made. A distinction many people struggle to understand. Actions create consequences. People simply meet them. One afternoon nearly 2 months later, I was sitting in a small neighborhood cafe. Alone. Peaceful. Free. An elderly woman sat beside me. Someone I'd seen there before. We occasionally exchanged greetings. Nothing more. That day she smiled. "You look lighter." I laughed. "Do I?" She nodded, then stirred her tea, and said something I will never forget. Sometimes the heaviest thing a woman carries is a version of someone she keeps trying to save. I sat quietly, thinking, because she was right. 4 years I'd been carrying Daniel. Not physically, emotionally, carrying his potential, carrying his excuses, carrying his image, carrying the person I hoped he would become. And the weight had been exhausting. The moment I stopped carrying it, I became free. Months passed. Life settled. Peace returned. Real peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from self-respect. The kind nobody can take from you. One evening, Camille visited. We sat on my patio watching the sunset. Talking. Laughing. Healing. At one point she asked a question. The same question everyone eventually asked. "Do you regret it?" I knew exactly what she meant. The marriage. The years. The trust. Everything. I thought for a long moment, then shook my head. No. She raised an eyebrow. Why not? I smiled, watching the sky turn gold. Because the answer had finally become clear. Because now I know the difference. The difference between what? I looked toward the horizon, then answered. The difference between being loved. A pause. And being valued. Real love doesn't require you to become smaller. Real love doesn't hide you. Real love doesn't rewrite your worth. And real class, it has nothing to do with titles, or promotions, or executive lounges, or expensive wine. Real class is how you treat people when they have nothing to offer you. That's the test. Always. And some people fail it spectacularly. As for me, I stopped trying to prove anything. Stopped trying to earn respect from people committed to misunderstanding me. Stopped explaining my worth. The funny thing about dignity is this: the moment you stop begging for it, people suddenly realize you had it all along. And somewhere along that journey, I discovered something beautiful. Peace. Not victory. Not revenge. Peace. The one thing Daniel spent years chasing through status, titles, and approval. The one thing he never seemed able to find. The one thing I found the moment I stopped needing validation from anyone else. And honestly, that was worth more than any promotion, more than any title, more than any board seat, more than any image. Because peace is real wealth. Everything else is just marketing. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Now I'd genuinely love to hear from you. If you were in my position, what would you have done when you heard that conversation in French? Would you have confronted them immediately? Or would you have stayed quiet and gathered the truth first? Let me know in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how many different places these stories reach. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, hidden strength, emotional intelligence, and powerful life lessons, stay with us. There are many more stories waiting for you. Until next time. Protect your peace, value your dignity, and never let anyone convince you that being underestimated means being powerless.